Okay, we are back. For those of you that may just be joining us, welcome to the fourth annual Carbon Dioxide Removal Law and Policy Conference. I'm Will Burns, co-director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal and a professor at Northwestern University. And it's time for our keynote presentation. And I'm very pleased to announce our keynote speaker today, Erin Burns, who serves as the director of the NGO Carbon 180. And Erin will address the issue of carbon removal as a public service, the U.S. government's role in scaling the carbon dioxide removal industry. We've set aside an hour for Erin's remarks and then questions. I will take the moderator's prerogative at the outset and ask Erin a question or two based on her presentation, and then we will go directly to questions from the audience. So I encourage you throughout Erin's presentation to begin to populate the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. And so with that, I will turn over the floor to Erin Burns.
Thank you so much, Will, and thank you guys for having me. As Will mentioned, I am Erin Burns, the Executive Director of Carbon 180, and I am going to share my screen or attempt to share my screen so that I can show a few slides. Okay, are folks able to see this?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. I like to do it in PDF because I tend to have some Google slide issues when I try to use that. So move these things out of the way. So for those of you not familiar with Carbon 180, as Will mentioned, we are an NGO, but we've been working on carbon removal for somehow about a decade now, I think 10 years this summer. So a very long time. And we work on all kinds of carbon removal, but we focus solely on carbon removal. And we've done this in a lot of different ways over the past 10 years, from running an incubator for private sector companies that place Heirloom and Carbon Plan started as part of our EIR program, to working with farmers and ranchers in the Mountain West, to working directly with environmental justice organizations in places that are likely to host carbon removal projects, to working more recently on U.S. federal policy. And specifically in the past 4 or 5 years, our focus really has been on using federal policy to scale what we call just, equitable, and highly accountable carbon removal. And federal policy is definitely my background. I got started in my career in the United States Senate, working on policies like the 45Q tax credit and point source carbon capture. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk about the future of carbon removal policy, and in particular, this idea of carbon removal as a public service. This is a very interesting time to talk about climate and carbon removal policy. So in the United States, today we have really unprecedented support and policy and federal policy for carbon removal. We've got $3.5 billion for direct air capture hubs. We've got things like $180 per ton in the 45Q tax incentive. We've got the first ever R&D programs for carbon removal. We have all of this enormous momentum on it. We've had an administration over the past 4 years who's really been the most supportive administration ever on carbon removal. They put in, into the agencies, they put in carbon removal advocates into high-level positions, which was entirely new. We see budget justifications for that include carbon removal, talk about legacy emissions. It is a really unique time to be working on carbon removal policy right now. All that said, we, of course, now have an incoming administration. This is where I'll point out that, by the way, Carbon 180, totally nonpartisan. We're a 501c3, but we do have an incoming administration. that is pretty openly hostile to attempts to address climate change. And I want to make sure it's clear that in our experience, that includes carbon removal. I think sometimes folks think that because things like carbon removal are bipartisan, that perhaps the incoming administration might be open to them. In my experience working under the last Trump administration, that isn't the case. However, I do believe we have an opportunity in the next 4 years to prioritize building what I would describe as durable political coalitions that are going to be needed under any political conditions to scale carbon removal. And I'm going to give a really quick example outside of just carbon removal and how I think this has been possible in the past. During the last Trump administration, they put out budgets for places like the Department of Energy that had enormous cuts to the applied offices. So the offices that focus on research for things like renewables, but also point source carbon capture and nuclear energy. But because these cuts were across the board at places like the Department of Energy, it allowed us to build really unique coalitions of folks who typically don't work together, but work against each other to defend budgets at the Department of Energy. And through the appropriations process and working with Congress, we were able to not only defend DOE spending, but actually see an increase in energy innovation spending and lead to a lot of the political conditions that allowed things like the Energy Act of 2020, which had the first ever carbon removal R&D program authorization in it, and even things like the IRA and infrastructure laws. So again, while we do have an administration coming in that does not support policy action on climate change, I do want to emphasize that we have the experience of having done this before and knowing that we can do, through congressional action, through other avenues, things to not only defend, but actually increase work, in particular in places like carbon removal. I'd also say it's a moment for us to be reminded that we shouldn't rely just on our own ideas about what's effective, but I think it's also a moment to embrace a broader vision of expertise. So for example, in our work at Carbon 180, we talk about rooting in the best available science, but also in equity and justice principles from the EJ movement, and the knowledge we gain directly from working with folks on the ground in places, the EJ organizations in places that are going to host these projects, we have a BIPOC Agroforestry Council representing producers from across the country. I think it's an opportunity to sort of expand the tent and what we care about and what kind of expertise we value in carbon removal. So, as Will said, I'm here to talk about carbon removal as a public service. And I'm going to talk a bit about what the unique attributes of carbon removal are, what some of the emerging ideas in U.S. federal policy to scale carbon removal are, and in my opinion, what else I think we need to be doing. So let's start on some things we can just sort of broadly probably agree on, but let's set the table here. So first, we are likely to need something like 10 gigatons of carbon removal in the world by mid-century. Some of those are going to be legacy emissions or addressing legacy emissions. Some of those are going to be offsetting hard to abate emissions. The second thing is that those gigatons are not going to be made up of a single kind of carbon removal, but a mix of pathways. So at Carbon 180, my colleague, Dr. Sifeng Chen on our science and innovation team, put together some back of the envelope deployment goals. I'm happy to share. She has a bunch of citations for this information, but some back of the envelope internal deployment goals, and we delineate these by where the CO2 ends up. So we're not talking about by particular technology pathway right now, but where that CO2 ends up. And with these calculations, you can see we currently expect about a third of those 10 gigatons to end up in geologic formations, obviously with very high durability, a third in biomass, and a third in soils and oceans. And of course, across those solutions, we have quite a bit of variation amongst durability. And all of this is really important when we're talking about the kinds of policies that are going to scale carbon removal. So we need a lot of carbon removal and we need different kinds of carbon removal. The third point is that there is no inherent market for carbon removal. The vast majority of pathways that we're talking about, they don't produce a product or a service. They don't make electricity. We often hear the comparison to things like waste management, though I think our comms team does not love me to use that example. But despite this, despite the fact that there is an inherent market, many of the policy mechanisms that have been most popular in scaling carbon removal in the US have been those originally designed to scale technologies for which there is an inherent market. So we've taken policies that have been helpful for things like point source CCS, renewables, and then tried to fit carbon removal into them. And further, we really routinely see people talk about carbon removal policies and say carbon removal policies, when really what we mean are policies for technologies like direct air capture. And then there's a tendency to try to fit non-technological carbon removal solutions into those tech policy frameworks. So let me use an example. 45Q is a tax credit. It was originally designed for point source CCS on power applications. And starting in about 2015, there was a relatively small but dedicated advocacy effort to include direct air capture, just direct air capture, into the 45Q tax credit. There was already an existing advocacy campaign to make updates to the 45Q tax credit that had nothing to do with carbon removal. But the carbon removal that direct air capture advocates were able to sort of jump onto. And for a lot of reasons, this worked very nicely. Direct air capture, the score for adding direct air capture into the piece of legislation at that time was $0 because they expected no carbon removal to be built no direct air capture, to be built in the next 10 years. And in early 2018, we saw the Future Act enacted into law, which included updates to the 45Q tax credit, including direct air capture for the first time. And this was really the first ever US federal policy for carbon removal. And there was lots of enthusiasm for that success. It happened pretty quickly with pretty minimal investments and advocacy, all things considered. And so as a result, we saw people attempting to put together coalitions for things like 45Q for trees. And this is something we continue to see over and over again. This sort of focus on tech-based policies first, and then attempts to move non-tech solutions into those frameworks. And I think we continue to see policy ideas really arise on what is sort of immediately in front of us, rather than grappling with the full scope of what needs to happen over the next decade, the unique characteristics of carbon removal, and very importantly, the political coalitions that are going to be needed to get us to gigaton scale. And so I believe it is within that context that has become increasingly popular amongst carbon removal advocates to propose a specific solution to getting to gigaton scale, which is let's build carbon removal markets. However, I will say I believe that markets are not the answer to scale carbon removal. And that in fact, the current emphasis on carbon removal the current emphasis on markets and scaling carbon removal is really wildly counterproductive. So I have a couple of points that I want to talk about and dig into on why I think we should not be focusing on compliance markets or market-based policies as the primary mechanism to scale carbon removal, particularly in the United States. The first is that we are unlikely to see compliance markets at the federal level in the United States. And I want to caveat this with, of course, there are going to be some jurisdictions, the European Union, Canada, some states like California and Massachusetts are going to implement moderately sized compliance markets that will include carbon removal. We, of course, see movement on compliance markets in, the EU's ETS. California has Buy Clean, low carbon fuel standard policies. Massachusetts just explicitly included carbon removal and land park climate legislation that was passed just last week. But these are places which have political environments where there is broad acceptance of both the need to address climate change and the role of government intervention in doing so. Federal policy in the US, however, does not operate under these conditions. Economy-wide climate regulation has been extraordinarily modest in the US. It has primarily happened under the Clean Air Act. And even the ability to regulate carbon dioxide emissions under the Clean Air Act, it was just codified through the Inflation Reduction Act. And this was, of course, after numerous legal challenges, things like West Virginia versus EPA, and attempts to regulate carbon emissions under the Clean Air Act. And And so I don't raise this to say that we should assume that because something hasn't happened, that it cannot happen. Instead, I raise it as a counter argument to the popular assumption that I see amongst people in carbon removal that compliance markets are a natural follow-on to today's voluntary markets. I don't think that's the case. So in addition to this, in addition to the sort of political challenges and political viability of this, I also want to point out that only some types of carbon removal are really appropriate for markets and market-based mechanisms. And those are specifically technologies with high MRV, high monitoring, reporting, and verification, and high durability. And these kinds of carbon removal, they're also a great fit for procurement and other mechanisms that we believe have far likelier pathways to enactment and can also be more effective. So here you see a list of legislation that has been introduced. We actually have bipartisan and both Democrat-led and Republican-led legislation that would enact federal procurement, federal purchasing of carbon removal. And in our view, pairing this with something like carbon border adjustment mechanism, also bipartisan, and then eventually a polluter pays mechanism, you're able to scale some of the higher durability carbon removal and also do so in ways that can build on some of those durable political coalitions, but also provide the customers that today's companies are really asking for when we're talking about markets. And I do want to take a moment here, though, to really emphasize that it's important that as we think about things like procurement as a policy mechanism, we also shouldn't over-focus on driving down the cost of expensive carbon removal. I think this is a mistake that has been made in the past for different kinds of technologies, but I think is especially important in something like carbon removal where we don't have an inherent market. And so it's always going to cost money, and it's not something where if you make solar cheap, you get lots of people buying solar. And even there, I think focusing only on cost would be a sort of losing strategy. And so I'm going to talk about, as much as our comms team has spent years making sure that folks know that carbon removal and carbon capture are two different things, I'm going to use a carbon capture example. I talked about policies like 45Q. This was really the primary policy that carbon capture advocates focused on. It's really about driving down the cost of CCS. We have, of course, not seen lots of CCS deployed. And I think we focused on that at the expense of other policies that were at least as important in deploying things like point source carbon capture. So, for example, we have seen more recent focus on infrastructure, including things like the EPA's Class 6 program, which is, of course, the permitting program for geologic storage in the United States. It has been underfunded. It has not gotten, we've had 2 functional Class 6 permits ever. And this was something that didn't get the same sort of advocacy and has been a barrier for point source CCS, but will certainly also be a barrier for direct air capture. So in addition to the kinds of carbon removal being that are a good fit for markets being a good fit for procurement and things like that already have, I think, much more likely pathways to enactment, and particularly right now in this political environment where we can get, the federal government purchasing carbon removal. It can help scale the really nascent carbon removal companies we see having, thrived with voluntary purchases. It can also crowd in some more voluntary purchases. There are a lot of reasons to be interested in things like procurement. But when we talk about the role of markets in scaling carbon removal, course, I'm going to have to mention that we have significant evidence that existing carbon markets have been ineffective and really rife with fraud. So that evidence is, of course, based almost entirely on reduction in offset credits, not removals. But I do think it has enormously important lessons for the potential efficacy of removal markets. I think it's also extremely important not to minimize the impact that this lack of efficacy or straight up fraud has had in the sort of confidence among key stakeholders in what should the role of carbon markets be. So as we think about what it's going to take for us to get to gigaton scale of carbon removal and those durable political coalitions, if we're starting with something like carbon markets as our silver bullet, I think it can really quickly undermine our credibility with important stakeholders. I think related to this, assuming compliance markets are the answer to scaling carbon removal has also resulted in short-term thinking on the kinds of carbon removal that we invest in today. And in particular, we've seen this result in a prioritization of those really durable, high MRV pathways at the expense of investments in pathways that are less suitable for markets, but I think are important in building those unique political coalitions. I mentioned before, I'll use an example here. I mentioned before that we work directly with a lot of environmental justice organizations, and specifically those who represent and have accountability to particular communities. So these are typically regional, not sort of national EJ organizations. And we talk to them about the full breadth of carbon removal. So we don't just talk about one particular solution, we talk about the full breadth, but a willingness to engage on things like soils or trees or things that have, in the near term, sort of lower CO2 removal potential has allowed us to build much more trust because these might have unique co-benefits, things like canopy cover in urban areas, and allowed us to build trust to talk more deeply and actually engage on what are the particular questions and concerns that they have about other kinds of carbon removal. If you guys were able to attend our carbon removal summit over the past, our carbon remover summit this year or in previous years, you'll see a really high level of engagement from many groups that I think folks in the carbon removal space have written off as sort of uninterested in what we're doing or hostile to what we're doing. And I think being willing to engage on things that are not just suitable for markets, that have benefits that we may not prioritize in terms of, just really high CO2 removal potential, is really key in building that trust. And then finally, I want to point out that I think our our focus on markets as the way to scale carbon removal can really distort what our priorities are right now. In particular, we've seen over the past, I would say like 18 months, 2 years, this enormous focus on MRV, which seems to come from the assumption that markets are going to be what scales carbon removal, and the ways in which we are going, the primary way in which we will avoid the sort of pitfalls of those offset markets is to make sure there's an enormous amount of rigor on MRV so that there isn't fraud. And I don't say this to undercut that MRV is important. Of course, it is important. But I think it might be like the second or third most important thing and not the first most important thing as we see if we are realistic about the kinds of policies that will in fact scale carbon removal. And I did want to drop in this quick slide to emphasize that, in fact, we do care a lot about MRV at Carbon 180, but we think about it a little bit differently. I mentioned before that our focus is on scaling just equitable and highly accountable carbon removal. And so we use this high accountability framework to talk about things like MRV, which again, I think has been, it's going to look different in the ways that we approach it because it doesn't rely on this assumption that markets are going to be how we scale carbon removal, which I think we see more broadly in the carbon removal field. I do want to recognize that we have, of course, seen voluntary markets for high quality carbon removal be wildly effective. So this is just pulling from the Frontier Advanced Market Commitment. But in saying that I don't believe that voluntary purchases are not going to be the way that we get compliance markets, I don't want to undermine the fact that voluntary purchases have been enormously helpful alongside federal policy to scale early stage carbon removal projects. But I think the point I want to leave you with here is that I think this shouldn't be the sort of starting point. This is not the center of our carbon removal universe, but just a helpful data point. Instead, I think if we start with the scale of what's needed, that 10 gigatons, the breadth of solutions that we need to be deployed, the current political conditions and how those may need to shift, and a sense of the timeline we have to make this all happen, that we're going to get a very different set of policy priorities. And so now that I have complained about markets, I have some thoughts on what we should do instead. So first, I do want to emphasize that I think there is that limited applicability of some market-based mechanisms for high durability carbon removal that mix, in our view, of federal procurement with carbon border adjustment mechanism and polluter pays. But there are things beyond that. So first, I think we need to invest in new kinds of policy development driven by state and regional coalitions. These state and regional coalitions are able to build uniquely diverse and durable political coalitions that lend on-the-ground insights, they lend credibility and nuance to efforts, I think, that are often oversimplified at the national level. So, for example, at the national level, carbon removal gets collapsed into very simple messages. And these simple messages are often polarizing or misleading. Things like carbon removal is just an excuse to produce more fossil fuels. And additionally, despite the fact that there's no place in the US where we're going to see every type of CDR deployed, the national conversation collapses that broad array of pathways into a single term of carbon removal. I think that really does a disservice to local and regional support for carbon removal pathways that are regionally specific. We also see in Congress that divisions tend to dissolve based on state and local priorities. So as we're thinking about building those durable political coalitions, investing in those state and local cases for carbon removal can be really invaluable. So, for example, we'll say, Republicans will vote for, we'll say Midwestern Republicans will advocate for and vote for wind power tax credits. That's not because they necessarily love, action on climate change, but because their states have lots of turbines. They have a particular case for it. Similarly, coal state Democrats have historically been the biggest champions for things like carbon management technologies because they see a role in their state for these to be deployed. So I think this is such an important part of the answer, especially right now, which is making carbon removal local makes it more popular, and it's really a necessary condition to durable political coalitions. So we can't just be developing as national organizations, developing our carbon removal policy ideas in a silo, going back to sort of what do we value as expertise? How do we ensure that not just the practitioners at the local level or the companies that are involved in it, but all of these other coalitions that you have these sort of, my dream is that we have all of these different kinds of cases for carbon removal that are sort of regionally, locally driven. We have a Texas case for carbon removal. We have a California case for carbon removal. All of these are going to look different. They're going to be sometimes contradictory, but I think it's a necessary condition for those really durable political coalitions that we're going to need to get us to gigaton scale. Next, I think policy development for carbon removal pathways should start with the kinds of policies that have been effective in those spaces instead of starting with existing carbon removal policies. So, for example, what are the kinds of land and ag policies that have been really effective? Use those as a starting point for soil carbon, not things like 45Q. Carbon removal, again, not one thing. And really the only thing that like direct air capture and trees have in common is like they happen to have a similar effect in removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's really about it. So we really need different kinds of policies to scale different kinds of removal pathways. And importantly, alongside that, we need a deep understanding of the political coalitions within those spaces. They are very different. Part of why we were able to get 45Q for direct air capture was because of the unique political realities within point source carbon capture and the political history there. Those things are going to be very different in agricultural policy and oceans policy and forestry policy and international policy. And we do ourselves a disservice with starting from sort of what's true, what we believe might be true in carbon removal policy, which again, I think is often code for sort of what's true right now in things like direct air capture policy. Next, I think we really need to prioritize policies for enabling infrastructure. Even if we were to have compliance markets in the US, maybe I'm totally wrong, and I will, we'll see compliance markets in the US in a few years. That we are still going to need federal policy for things like enabling infrastructure. We're going to need more renewables deployment. We're going to need better Class 6 program. We're going to need CO2 pipelines. We're going to have to grapple with how regulatory policy intersects with ocean carbon removal. We're going to need lots of kinds of policy and market-based mechanisms or policies that are just bringing down the cost of carbon removal are going to be insufficient. We need to think about that enabling infrastructure. The final point I want to make is that there's also no silver bullet. I believe it's going to be a mix of really small and medium-sized policies. That's a particularly important concept, I think, right now, because as we see, we need policies that are going to have life beyond particular administrations. While the current administration has had sort of unprecedented support for carbon removal, we're going into a new administration that is hostile to climate and likely carbon removal. And if you have a single large policy that tends to have far less lasting power under political changes, those mix of small and medium-sized policies that you're able to embed in different places that are able to reflect really unique coalitions that don't just have to like carbon removal for those sort of high-level talking points, but can be wound up with other things are much more durable in the near term. And I think that's a particularly salient point right now. So I am at my 30-minute mark. And so I do want to wrap up where I started. I will say I am very optimistic that we can get to gigaton scale and that we can do really enormously impactful work towards that goal, even under tough political circumstances. Success, however, I believe will rely on us doing things a little bit differently. I think grappling with the fundamental nature of carbon removal as something without an inherent market, as something that is not one thing, but a bunch of very different things. And using those facts to really prioritize over the next few years, building those durable political coalitions. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the invitation. And I am really looking forward to questions.
All right. Thank you so
Stop.
much. Thank you so much for that, Erin. And I'm going to encourage everybody to populate the Q&A box with your questions while I try to seed the discussion with a couple of my own at the outset. So one question is, from a standpoint of procurement, right? I guess this is a logistical question. What what do you think this should look like? How large does procurement have to be in the United States to really drive this goal of getting to, gigaton or multi-gigaton scales by the middle of the century or beyond? And what do you think that these kind of numbers that I would assume we would need in terms of purchases are realistic in this political environment or anyone moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I'm going to shout out my colleague, John Milko here, who is leading our procurement work and has a really fantastic procurement report. But I think a couple things. The first is procurement's only a good fit for certain kinds of carbon removal. So I don't think, much like markets aren't the silver bullet, procurement, you're not going to have, sort of a one size fits all carbon removal procurement program that works for everything. And that's how we're going to scale it. And I don't think that's a particularly durable approach either. But I do think that we can have, I think a $500 million per year procurement program is really within reach. And I think that it's important now to go back and say, well, what are the ways in which we might scale up procurement? So one way might be that you have a single, carbon removal agency that, purchases carbon removal. there are some benefits to that. I think one very big downside is that those big programs tend to have a target on their back as political winds sort of change. So, for example, the thing I'm most nervous about over the next few years is the future of the Direct Air Capture Hubs program. It is a $3.5 billion program. We've seen the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration really take the lead on this, even though technically the authorization does live within the Office of Fossil Energy. And I just think it's probably not long for this world under a new administration. I wish that were not the case. And so instead, we might think about procurement where we embed it within agencies that what I worry less about is, I think we'll still get plenty of R&D funding for carbon removal and, the national labs will be secure and things like that, that you're not going to be able to, those don't have as much of a target and they're not as easy to untangle. And so as you think about sort of how do you embed something like procurement within agencies rather than having a single program, I think it can feel it's a little messier in terms of, policy design, just from a sort of academic standpoint. But I think it gives you the opportunity to build really interesting political coalitions. It gives you far more, I think, stability across political changes and administration and things like that. It's harder to unwind. And so I still think you're able to get to something like a $500 million per year program for carbon removal within, I'd say, a decade. This is a very Erin Burns. This is not, I mentioned John Milko on our team. He might have a different opinion, but having worked in this space for a while, that would be my guess for like an optimistic scale. But I think it's probably smarter for us to think about how we embed that in different places rather than just say like, oh, we have a DOE program or we have a single program somewhere.
And if I don't know if there's been any kind of quantification from Carbon 180's side in that context, but if we were to get a $500 million over the course of the next decade, what would that get us from a standpoint of removals?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in our estimation, again, procurement is still a good fit for high durability carbon removal. So I could do a quick back of the envelope here that if we imagine that the average cost of sort of high durability carbon removal might be somewhere right now around $200 per ton. Maybe it's a little bit cheaper. Some things that, I think we'd in particular from the United States government want to see them purchase a mix of more expensive, less expensive, things that are higher risk, things that are lower risk. Then I think we're talking about things that on average about $200 per ton. I think a really important piece of this, as much as I've just talked about my deep skepticism of markets, is that I think this can be really catalytic in driving additional voluntary purchases. Something we hear over and over again is that, of course, lots of companies do not have the ability of the same ability that Frontier or Stripe or Shopify have to do their sort of own due diligence on new projects. Having a federal stamp of approval on a particular kind of carbon removal means that you're going to get other people who are coming in to buy that kind of carbon removal. So I think that it's not just about that sort of whatever 500 million, getting something like, 200, I'm sorry, like getting something like 2 million tons per year, 10 million tons per year, whatever that could look like, depending on that cost curve coming down over time. But it's going to be the additional removals that you get from the private sector.
Yep. You you were talking about fraud, right, in the voluntary carbon markets, right? And again, the emphasis being that a lot of this was in the context of avoided removals, but obviously the possibility in terms of carbon removal also. How do you think that a federal carbon procurement program would avoid the same kind of rent-seeking behavior on the part of players as opposed to what we see in the voluntary market? Because the voluntary markets do have certification organizations, right, that presumably of high integrity that are seeking to ferret that out, and obviously have failed to a high degree, at least in the context of avoided removals. Is your argument that the federal government in its procurement process will do a better job?
Definitely. That's definitely part of my argument. I mean, that's not to say you don't need safeguards in there, but I think that um, you remove um, some of the incentives to buy low quality carbon removal. So the federal government, one thing you might not do in a procurement program is say that the federal government is purchasing carbon removal. And I think this goes back to this as a public service rather than focusing it on a market-based mechanism, which is I don't think you necessarily should tie this into net zero targets from the federal government to say we're buying carbon removal to meet some sort of net goal, but instead building it into larger emissions goals that aren't about, we saw starting under the Obama administration executive orders around sort of particular agencies reducing their footprint and claims against, those carbon footprints. And I think we've seen that sort of encourage questionable claims on carbon removal. I think this is also why we do need to invest in MRV. My concern is just that it's not sort of right sized for how important it is. But we have supported the carbon removal standards initiative that my colleague Anu Khan has been leading, CIRCE, which is really fantastic. Actually, everybody who leads our science and innovation program, I think, ends up leaving to start an MRV thing. Peter Miner before her left to start a MRV company. So I think the MRV piece is really important, but I think it's also about pulling apart like the sort of understanding of like why are people making those claims. And I think that's why we need to disentangle it as something where they're going to put it against something like net zero targets and instead say, this is actually a public service that we're thinking about. Like, we're just, investing things like, when we talk about things like Department of Energy funding for carbon removal, that it's, we're just investing in this. You get returns on this, like it's investing in the US economy. I think there are a lot of messages like that are going to be important. That will also, like in that, how it's structured will disincentivize some of that fraud.
Okay.
And I'm gonna,
Uh, yeah.
no,
And
good.
one final question before we go to the audience questions. You're estimating maybe we get millions of tons through procurement, right? And ultimately, probably the U.S. government or the U.S. should probably be on the hook for billions of tons, right? By the time we get to 2050, from an equity standpoint and from a practical standpoint of CDR making a difference, does that suggest that given the fact the voluntary carbon markets probably are never going to scale to anywhere near that level, and government procurement's probably not going to get us there either, does it suggest a role for compliance markets? And if it does, how do we stage gate that? Should we be trying to start off with, extremely modest sort of carbon take back obligations as some of the Europeans have suggested that would scale over time? Or are there other approaches? Or do you just think that any discussion of compliance markets at this point are doomed and we try to talk about it at some point in the future? What does that look like to you?
I think there's a chance we'd never need compliance markets in the US. And it's not to say that we couldn't use them or imagine a world in which they're either both politically possible or actually effective. I think my concern is that there's this sort of assumption that we're going to move from these voluntary markets that have been really effective in carbon removal specifically, not the offset markets, but these voluntary purchases that we've seen from Frontier and others, wildly effective, much more rigorous standards, really, much more accountability in those purchases. And that's going to be sort of this natural on-ramp into compliance markets in the US. And to get to compliance markets in the US, you need to invest enormously in a very different sort of political landscape. I don't see that happening. But I think it's also something where we're shortchanging lots of kinds of carbon removal that aren't good for compliance markets, for example. So let's talk about like soil carbon. Soil carbon isn't going to be probably a good fit for things like compliance markets or tax incentives, but you might have a block grant program for states and regions to meet climate goals. And part of this is soil carbon, because really what we care about, if we're talking about this in terms of climate impact, we don't care that, farmer A has, isn't is kind of sort of like acre by acre, foot by foot, has the highest quality MRV. What we care about is like, we'll say like Montana or the Midwest as a whole is moving back into a carbon sink, and we're going to, see more and more CO2 removed through soils and the American Midwest. Like those are the kinds of things we actually care about. And so if that's the case, then I think we start with a very different kind of set of policies that are going to scale things like carbon removal. I think we're starting to, there are a lot of research and science questions on the efficacy of ocean carbon removal and what that can look like, but that's going to look very different than the kinds of policies like compliance markets. And so I think it's something where I would just suggest that we need to really ratchet down how important we think compliance markets are, and instead start with, we're likely to need trillions of dollars for carbon removal. The US should be on the hook for lots and lots of that, for billions of tons of carbon removal, whether we build that here or just pay for it. And so how do you start with the sort of like, how do you build those political coalitions that are going to get you there, rather than saying, hey, we really are comfortable with the idea of compliance markets because that's the kind of world that we live in. Like we've seen the models, we already know this. Customers are helpful for this, voluntary purchases. And I think those are the sort of set of assumptions we're starting with. And I think that's the wrong starting point.
All right, great. Okay, let's move to some audience questions. First one, on the position that there's not a market for CDR, would not the production of, say, a carbon negative foodstuff or carbon negative materials like biochar represent a type of market?
Sure. Definitely, we can see durable products. I'm on the board of the Global CO2 Initiative at University of Michigan, where we talk a lot about CO2 to products. But I think it's just a really small, it's a really small sliver of that whole, 10 gigaton pie that we see. And that's separate than when we talk about like compliance markets. So yes, you can turn CO2 into valuable stuff, hopefully stuff that stores the CO2 for a long time. And you can get people to buy that. We've already seen, Carbon Cure, Solidia come to mind, but lots of different companies make business cases off of this for sure.
Okay. Next question. Is procurement alone capable of sustaining a multi-gigaton future for CDR, or in light of your observation about the better endurance that comes from diversity, should we be looking for ways to advance multiple approaches, multiple revenue models, multiple models for MRV, both in procurement and in market contexts?
Yeah, listen, I think the answer is lots of kinds of policies. I think this gives you, more stability across changing political winds. I think the more that you can take both carbon removal as a concept and the policies that are going to support it and break it down, I think too. I feel like for those of us who've been working in climate policy for a long time, we have that sort of like EPA pie chart of emissions by sector sort of like seared into our brain. And in some ways, the mental model for that, I think, is then that carbon removal is sort of like a little sliver of that pie. It's like its own whole pie. We are talking about a massive amount of carbon removal, and it's all very different things. So the sorts of things, for example, you wouldn't suggest the same kinds of policies to decarbonize the transportation sector as you would the agricultural sector. These are wildly different things. So I think it is absolutely, the answer is that you need lots of kinds of policies, and you need policies that are rooted in the actual political and like technical scientific realities of each of these kinds of carbon removal pathways. Like it's almost like an illusion that carbon removal is a thing in and of itself. It's just like an outcome of a bunch of different kinds of things that have basically nothing else in common, right? Like trees and direct air capture just happen to both remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and that's like the end of their similarities.
All right. Uh, is there not also a risk in having all procurement go through the federal government or a federal agency? What if the politics lead to deprioritizing community aspects of quality?
I think it's a norm. And look, I think procurement is a part of the solution. I think this is also a benefit in thinking about. So when we're talking about procurement, we're talking in our opinion about higher MRV, higher durability carbon removal. And I think that's where too, if you embed it within places like certain agencies and you make it and break it into smaller pieces, that's one way to, keep it stable over sort of like political changes. It's something that ends up being just about like the congressional priorities. And then you're able to, I think, pairing that with that investment in local and regional coalitions who are going to build local and regional cases for carbon removal gets you much more durability. So it's like, look, I talked about the role that equity and justice plays in Carbon 180's work. And it's, for us, it's about basing it in the best available science and in environmental justice. And when we talk about that, we know that the accountability piece is going to be true everywhere, but the equity and justice piece is extremely place-based. And so it shouldn't be organizations like Carbon 180 who are deciding what just and equitable carbon removal is. It should be the places that are going to host these projects. And to do that, we need a massive shift of resources into those places. There are places that are going to host these projects who do not have access to philanthropy, to other capital to build the civil society capacity and have the kind of influence that they should have on the policies that are going to determine what carbon removal looks like in the future. And not only does it have that necessary community benefit, that like moral imperative we have when we're talking about why we even work in climate and carbon removal, but it also has the benefit, I think, of investing policymakers in a much deeper way in carbon removal. If anybody here has worked in Congress, that like those particular pet projects or the particular sorts of things that come from somebody's state or region, like those are the things that they really go to bat for. And a lot of those sort of like national level political messages, I mentioned renewable energy. In general, we think of renewables and climate change as something that Democrats support, that Republicans, even if we look at the Department of Energy funding, you're going to have Democrats with amendments to support more money to energy efficiency and renewable energy, and Republicans who are going to like say, let's take it away. And lots of Republicans vote for things like the wind PTC because their states benefit from the wind PTC and they have lots of wind. So anyways, I think it's about the design of this. And I think more fundamentally, it's about shifting power into those communities, into those states and regions, and letting them have much more of a say, be driving in a sort of way that they aren't today because they don't have those resources, what the policy future for carbon removal looks like.
Okay. Let me ask you something related to agencies that I was thinking about before. If we're thinking about the shorter term, right, the Trump administration, right? Um, and you said agencies that might be involved in procurement. Who do you think, from a practical standpoint, in this upcoming administration, which agencies might do that, right? For example, Department of Energy is about to be headed by a guy who says climate change is a hoax. Okay. And so I know there's political cross currents and pull to red states for other reasons, right? But if somebody who starts off with that premise is probably not likely to say, let's spend a whole lot of money on buying carbon removal, right? So what agencies do you think might be most propitious to be making that ask to under the Trump administration?
Yeah, I think DOE is still a good place to do this. And because one, every agency is going to be headed by somebody who has sort of outrageous views about climate change. Like, I'm not expecting any agency to be like, that's headed by somebody who I agree a lot with on climate change and carbon removal. And I think if we're talking about the next 4 years, we are talking about we're not talking about that $500 million, right? We're talking about a pretty moderately sized procurement program, maybe tens of millions of dollars. And I think if you embed it in a place, DOE is not a monolith. So let's talk about where you might embed it in DOE. I would embed it at the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, probably. They have a lot of the expertise. And even though you're going to have that turnover at the political level, you have civil servants who have served under Trump administration, who have served under a Biden administration, who are in there and care about the work. And what we saw under the last Trump administration was even though they tried to sort of their budgets like really gutted. Okay, listen, here's my little anecdote. They didn't just gut Department of Energy spending and we're like, no, let's not spend on, like renewables. They apparently believed that point source carbon capture was too progressive. It was too climate forward to invest in point source carbon capture. And what they wanted to do at the Office of Fossil Energy was invest in something called small modular coal. What is small modular coal? I have no idea. Somebody's fever dream reading any, like small modular reactors and like they saw, steam methane reformer and they saw SMR and it just like, I don't know, like all got, I have no idea where this came from. But this is without CCS, to be clear. Small modular coal without CCS. This was the priority. And Congress said, we are not doing that. Congress said, no, we're going to get more money. We had I think it was under the Trump administration, congressional action had the first money for point source CCS on industrial sources. That we got the first ever R&D, we got $60 million in 2019 for carbon removal R&D, and we'd had no money before that. And the money's flowing through places like the national labs that are, if we think about where the money for FECM flows through, it's the National Energy Technology Laboratory in my home state of West Virginia and in Pennsylvania, in places where they have really embedded like political support for these places. And so I think it's about how you design them and where you put them, where I'm worried, for example, about the DAC Hubs program going through something like OSED, very new, very big. I'm not so much worried about the R&D program for carbon removal because even though it's new, it's, 60 to $70 million. It's going to go through places like the national labs and grants to universities. So I think that's really the thing. It's about that particular design. And if we're going to get something over the next 4 years that's say $50 million, it's something that's going to be bipartisan. So you're going to have Republican congressional support, and it's going to be $50 million. It's not going to be anybody's first priority to sort of gut but it's really important to think about where that goes, who's going to get to make decisions about spending it, that sort of thing.
Okay. Question about your reference to the polluter pays principle, right? As a
Yeah.
relevant principle. Doesn't isn't the polluter pays principle premised on the idea that it's the polluters, not the government, that pays for CDR? And so if you embrace the polluter pays principle, doesn't that by terms suggest a role for compliance markets and responsibility on the part of the polluters to pay, which would include things like carbon removal obligations on the part of fossil fuel companies?
It could. And look, this is again, maybe there's a role for smaller scale compliance markets, and we are going to see them in certain jurisdictions. But I think you could also imagine a polluter pays, let's use like oil spill pipeline, oil spill pipeline fund or the abandoned mine land fund. This is like a per ton tax on oil shipments on coal production that's used to deal with, either legacy issues with when we're talking about the Man Mine Land Fund or future pipeline spills. So there are also ways where you can imagine something like a polluter pays as creating the fund through which that like pays the government or that the government uses to purchase that carbon removal. So it's not requiring companies to have climate goals, but it is saying, okay, the government's going to buy this, then who's put that CO2 in the atmosphere? They're going to have to like give the government some money to go ahead and do that. And it's going to give you some quality control opportunities, but I think it also is going to appeal, if I think about some of the more traditionally conservative climate organizations who have thought about things like procurement can be much more straightforward or easier to detect things like fraud than something like the 45Q tax incentive, where there have been concerns about who's actually been able to claim this and if they're actually removing CO2. That I think that a lot of things like even the polluter pays, as funding something like federal procurement can have a lot of appeal to traditional conservatives who are agreeing that, hey, whatever reason, value in us addressing climate change, this is the sort of way that makes the most sense for us to approach it. This is like, good use of taxpayer dollars or not using taxpayer dollars, and that it's like transparent government that can be held accountable. And I think that's something we've seen as we've started to build coalitions on procurement.
All right. One last question. If we ask farmers, for example, to bet on procurement, are we once again tying them to a risky political gamble that the government will keep writing the check?
Um, yeah, probably procurement's not the thing for farmers. We should just like we should do other things. Not the answer for that. That's yeah. Procurement's probably only a good fit for stuff like direct air capture, certain like bioenergy pathways that we might see scale, really high durability, high MRV stuff. So I think we need very different political coalitions, and I think they should be driven by those producers. Like those producers should be telling us like what are the kinds of policies that are going to help you, store more carbon in your soils.
All right, that seems like a good place to conclude. Once again, thanks very much, Erin, for sharing your thoughts on this. It's good for us to be thinking about what this portfolio of responses should be in terms of carbon removal, and this is a good part of that ongoing discussion. So, thank you very much. Thank you
Thanks
to
for
the
having me.
audience for all of your questions, and we will. Reconvene in 5 minutes for our second panel today. So please come back then. Thank you.